Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest again is Mr. Nick Jacobellis. Nick is a retired customs agent who has been on our show before talking about his time working in Florida with a group called the Blade Runners. Nick, welcome back.
How you doing, Ben? Good to be back.
We're doing great. So, those who may have joined us for the last episode got to learn a little bit about Nick's background. As I said, he's a retired federal agent. Prior to that, he was a New York detective and a New York State cop. He's been involved in law enforcement for decades. He is now a successful published author. He's published like 13 books, and that's the books are what we're here talking about today. He's written a book called Controlled Delivery. I believe there's actually two volumes. Is that not correct, Nick?
Correct.
So,
Part
so
one and two.
so as a two-parter called Control Delivery, which I initially thought, since Nick is a fabulous fiction author, I thought these were tales of fiction. These are actually memoirs of Nick's time in Florida working drug interdiction while he was with Customs. So these are true stories based off Nick's career, which I did not stress well enough in the last episode. So before we kind of pick up where we left off, Nick, what I'd really like to hear is just briefly what you had to do to get this vetted, because this sounds like stuff that maybe you can't just be going out and talking about without getting somebody's permission.
Right. At the time, I started writing this as things were unfolding. And I did that for two reasons. One was because I knew I was going to have to put in a request for authorization to publish it. Two, I wanted to remember everything. And I had no idea how it was going to get published down the road. As far as the process went, there was a opportunity for me to basically at some point take the manuscript and submit it to Air Ops. They got it first, and they approved it. And then I sent two copies subsequently as I kind of edited things and whatnot to headquarters, and they approved it. So I had to get approval from basically just the Customs Service. And I tried whatever's in the book is something that they approved, and I didn't have to go to any other agencies to get anything else vetted from them.
Very cool. And I've actually had some great feedback from listeners about previous episode, the previous episode. And I believe that what you just said answered their question, because they stated it sounded like you were doing a lot of interagency and joint coordination. But sometimes you didn't mention what those different agencies were. And I'm assuming that allowed you to not have to get your work vetted by those agencies as well. Is that correct?
Well, in the book, I mentioned DEA, I mentioned the FBI. Obviously, we used Air Force AWACS. United States Navy was incredibly cooperative and helpful in the next episode that we'll do. The Coast Guard was very significant in helping us out. Uh, we uh, we had obviously Customs Service, Air Operations was incredibly helpful. So there were other agencies, and we worked with state and locals, Broward County Sheriff's Office. When we did controlled deliveries, like for example, in Boston, the state troopers were there. There were police officers from other jurisdictions that were involved in the takedowns. So it was a cast of thousands at times when necessary.
Understood. So controlled delivery, we went into it in the last episode, but for folks who might be tuning in for the first time, remind the listeners what a controlled delivery is in customs parlance.
It's a transportation case in the simplest terms, but it's really a covert operation, an undercover operation, like a sting operation, where we infiltrate a smuggling organization at the highest levels that we're able to. There's usually a broker involved who was the middleman, the person that represented the best interest of the smuggling organization in Colombia, and would meet with us and bridge the gap between the two and kind of massage the deal together. And our mission was to completely control the delivery of contraband. And it could be any kind of contraband. In our case, it was usually multi-hundred and down the road, multi-thousand kilogram shipments of cocaine. And we also did 7,000 pounds of marijuana in one of our aircraft with a coke load and another pot load, marijuana load. But the primary purpose of our operation, and we also did a container case involving, believe it or not, counterfeit Chanel products that went to New York. So it didn't, contraband is contraband. And if they made it illegal to have vacuum cleaners, we would have been bringing vacuum cleaners in our aircraft. That's just, it sounds funny, but that's the way the law is. Whatever's contraband, it was something that we usually tried to infiltrate a group to get their contraband and then lock everybody up and eliminate that avenue from the chain.
Understood. So it's the at this point in time, it's the late 80s. You've been fighting the drug war for a few years now down in Florida. You came up with this idea that if you pose as, middlemen, or pose as, smugglers who are willing to move product for dealers or distributors, they're going to pay you to do this. So in essence, they think they're paying you to move their product. They're actually literally paying you to seize their stuff and lock them up, or
Correct.
at least the folks they're working with.
That's right. And then we would use the money that we received to go after the next group. So one group basically paid us so that we would use the assets, the financial assets, to go after the next group that we infiltrated.
And that's kind of where we left at the end of last episode. You came up with the idea that, hey, we can kind of do this in perpetuity. As we get paid from one operation, we can use to fund the next. Your bosses loved it because it was self-sustaining, and you were ready to launch your first big operation. So could you tell us, once the Blade Runners were up and running and you guys are ready to do the first big controlled delivery, how that went down?
I happened to be up in the SAC office, the Special Agent in Charge office in Boston, and group supervisor up there, Jimmy, and I were sitting at his desk one day, and he was pacing. And bottom line was, he had a really good opportunity to infiltrate a Colombian-based smuggling organization, but he had no means to do it. He had someone who infiltrated a group. They were willing to come up with front money, which would be a basic amount of expense money to get the deal off the ground. They wanted to see his plane. Well, the Customs Service didn't have a fleet of undercover planes lined up for agents to use. So, our Uncle Sam was a guy on a recruiting poster. He wasn't in the plane business. So I'm sitting at his desk and I go, "Hey, guess what? I've got this operation I just started. Let me use your phone? I'll call the boys up in Florida." So I call my crew up, who I had approached originally to start this off. Before I even went to the Special Agent in Charge, I went to all the sources who had helped me seize aircraft and assets and including a car dealership and whatnot. And I said, "Hey, you guys, are you in on this?" And they all agreed. So I called them on the phone and I said, "Hey, we got our first mission. I need an aircraft. We need to fly about 2,000 miles nonstop." This is in December of 1988. It's the winter time. So we're going to fly into a jungle airstrip in Colombia, but on the way back, we got to go all the way to Boston. And the rules of engagement were, it was kind of crazy at the time. Region 1, which later changed, was like from Maine, the Canadian border, down to Baltimore. We had to get this load to Region 1 so that the Boston agents would get the stat for this. So we have to risk this crew's life and everything that we've got on the line here for our careers to fly in the dead of winter from Colombia to New England, because that's the way it goes. And it would have been so much easier to fly in the sunshine of Florida, throw it on a C-130, which we ended up doing later on a few times, and fly the load to Boston to do the controlled delivery. But these were the beginning days, and we were learning. And the system was the system, and we had to either take the mission or go home and do something else. So we fly, we get the front money, go to Florida. Bad guys want to see the plane. We repositioned the plane in West Palm. I walk in the RAC office, the Resident Agent in Charge office in Fort Lauderdale, with two agents from the SAC office in Boston. I introduce him to the RAC, who knew me obviously as a Miami agent. And while we're talking, he gets a phone call. He says, "Excuse me, guys." He answers the phone. "Oh, great. You did what?" "Oh, you seized the plane." And we're listening to this conversation. One of his agents seized our plane because we put phony tail numbers on it. So now I'm going like, "I got some bad news, but you need to unseize this aircraft," which was a real pain in the neck to do because he had already called up. Anyway, it worked out. They unseized the aircraft. Bad guys came, saw the plane. They loved it. And it came time to take off, and we were short on expense money. So the contract pilot, who was one of my first major assets, I call him the gambler because he rolled the dice with us all the time. He took an IOU. gave us the keys. Said, go ahead. So Captain Video was a contract pilot that we recruited. I mentioned earlier, I think in the first episode, about working with the FBI. He was an airline pilot who had been approached, basically. And when the bad guy bought a plane for him to use to smuggle a load, it was actually a big seaplane. It was an Albatross, Grumman Albatross seaplane. I seized the plane, and the guy walked because he knew that he couldn't answer questions about why he had purchased this aircraft. So here we are with Captain Video. We call him Captain Video because he used to come to the undercover office and play video games landing on a carrier. This is like an ancient late 1980s when these video games were kind of not what they are today. But I said, you do really well. I hope you fly better than that. So we call him Captain Video. And the major was the only African-American pilot in our unit and in our group. And he was a very highly decorated Vietnam era helicopter pilot and a cargo plane pilot as well. So the two of them and the Boston contract pilot get in this aircraft with ski suits and a roll of duct tape. And they take off. And as they're proceeding, to Colombia, it's okay. They're not wearing the heavy clothing and whatnot. When they reach the coordinates, they're flying over the jungle. The major, I used to call him the major. He's looking down. He thinks he's back in Vietnam. This is great. He's loving this. And finally, they see this dirt strip. So they land. And as soon as they land, the plane gets surrounded with guys with rifles. And the Colombians basically level the rifles and they're pointing it at the plane. It's just like a movie now. And the crew is up in the cockpit. And when the door opens, I'm assuming if they don't see the right person, it's game over. So when the cargo door in the back opened up and they saw the Boston contact, they lower their weapons and greet the crew, feed them, get them something to drink, and refuel the aircraft. As soon as they're refueled, Jeep comes out of the jungle with 520 keys of coke, loaded on board. They start to take off. They kind of get stuck in the sand, but they power out of it, take off. Everything is fine. They're on their way back. Now, I'm up in Boston now at the SAC office with Jimmy and another agent, Dick O, who was a Secret Service agent on Jackie Kennedy's detail, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Really nice guy. And it's snowing. I'm looking out the window and I'm going like, if everything could be possible, if this could be worse right now, it couldn't get any worse. This is it. Now we're in a blizzard where these guys are flying into in a plane with no heat. And the bad part about it was initially our air assets that were sensor birds that were trying to pick them up on radar because we were tracking them because we had a tracking device inside the aircraft. They can't find them. So now all of us are pacing because we're worried about these guys. Like, what happened to them? Did they crash? Did they ditch? Finally, a custom citation jet flying out of Gitmo picks them up on radar, and they're being followed north. And as they're being followed north, they're flying into a storm. So now they're putting duct tape everywhere because there's like snow coming inside the aircraft. Now they're wearing their ski suits and gloves and whatnot, and the plane is starting to, ice up and freeze up. And we finally get in contact. And as soon as we get in contact with them, I'm talking to them over the phone via customs radar assets and customs aircraft. So they're relaying this. We're actually talking to the crew. And they told us there's no bad guys on board, which was critical. And they had the load. They had the 500 plus kilos. So I turned to Jimmy and I said, you just made the biggest cocaine seizure in the history of New England since the Pilgrims landed. Congratulations. And all they needed to do is now land in Cape Cod. That's where they were going, to Otis Air Force Base. Unfortunately, things got so bad, they had to divert. And we set it up where they could land in Baltimore, which was the lowest jurisdictional cutoff for Region 1. So Jimmy and his SAC office got the stat.
Got it.
They land, they refuel, custom citation jet goes in with them. Everybody refuels, grabs coffee, does what they got to do, get in the aircraft, take off. Now they're flying into a blinding snowstorm. It's a blizzard. So we drive out to Otis Air Force Base, and on the way we get told they just closed the runway. So now we have a plane flying back to New England in a blizzard and no place to land. So we basically relay through Customs Air assets, have them land in Hyannis at the airport on Cape Cod. And it was closed, but we opened it. And it was whiteout conditions. And I'm kneeling under the wing of a plane. I'm wearing boat shoes. Jimmy says to me, you're a typical Miami agent. It's a blizzard out and you're wearing boat shoes. And all of a sudden we've got this Citation jet and they're using their F-16 radar to basically tell our crew, you're 500 feet, you're 400 feet, you're 300 feet, you're 200 feet, and then they turn the runway lights on. You should see the lights and it's white out. So everything is just white. We hear the engines, they land safely. And when the door opened and I went to get on board, the Boston contract pilot just stormed past me because he was just like a wreck after. I mean, I don't blame the guy. It was a tough flight. So I go on board and there's duct tape everywhere. You seal the plane and the cocaine is solid as a rock. It's frozen. Everything's frozen on board. So the guys got ski suits on. And what hit me at the time was, and we talked about this, as a kid, I used to watch 12 O'Clock High and the TV series when it came out. And as you know from your military days, in the military, they have what they call acceptable losses. You run an operation, it's dangerous, it's combat conditions, people are going to get hurt. It's just the way it goes. Sometimes nobody gets hurt. But when people do get hurt, usually the bosses through your chain of command consider that an acceptable loss. Well, when they sent 21 bombers out to bomb Germany and 19 came back and 20 guys didn't, that was an acceptable loss because they were trying to win the war through the air power. We sent one plane out, one had to come back. We had no such thing as acceptable losses.
Understood.
From day one, I would tell everybody, we either win or we stop. And I think that made us so concerned about each other's safety, and that we just took the time to just dot every I and cross every T to the nth degree. And one of the tactics that I think I mentioned the last time, or we talked about on the phone, was when we recorded conversations, we would listen to them over and over again. That was probably one of the smartest things we ever did. Anybody who's in intelligence work should just learn how to do that. People say things that they don't realize what they're saying. And when they're being recorded and you listen to those tapes over and over, you learn the enemy. And you use that against them down the road. And it worked every time. So the delivery was up in Methuen, Massachusetts, next to a McDonald's. And it was in a kind of a storage facility. And one of our helicopters kind of low flies the parking lot. There were people sitting in their cars eating French fries and whatnot. And here comes this helicopter. I mean, it was low. And the deal, everybody kind of moved in. The bad guys were arrested. And it was a happy ending to the first mission. We went back to Florida and we picked up 2 quick missions for the FBI and DEA. The first one was 350 keys and an aero commander that we used, crew of 2. On takeoff from Colombia, they damaged the undercarriage. The aircraft was flying slower than normal. When they're coming back to the US, to South Florida, they kind of cut the line at the by Cuba over Gitmo. And I'm in the Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport Police Station with 2 FBI agents. Rick Chenevier was one of the agents that was with us, and Kenny Parkinson was the other. And Kenny gave me his permission to use his name. We're Facebook buddies. And the phone rings, I answer it, it's Custom C3I, and they're going, Nick, the Cuban MiGs just launched on your plane. And I'm going like, okay, operations could be coming to a crashing halt any minute now, because they were famous for taking off and trying to use their jets to make the pilots crash. Well, it didn't work. Our crew kept going. They landed in Fort Lauderdale. We got them cleared. And then they took off and came up to Fort Lauderdale Exec. we delivered that load. Then we did a 300-kilo load, delivered that, and basically walked away from it.
Now, were
And
you using the same team from Boston, the same pilots, the major?
no, no, no. We had a
Cafeteria?
different crew, different. We tried to rotate things so everybody got a bite of the apple. And when we used the seaplanes, we had the same primary pilot because he was the most experienced. He had like 10,000 hours flying in these things.
Gotcha.
And we also used a complement of either one or two extra co-pilots and a flight engine. We used to have flight engineer, crew chief that would go along usually. And
Track.
if we had to, we would take along one or two other people who represented another agent's end of the undercover operation, so the bad guys would know who that person is, like in the Boston case.
Tracking. So another quick question. I don't want to divert you from your storyline, but so you use an aerial commander on these next two missions, and I'm assuming you never had a steady, stable aircraft. You have to get a new aircraft every time you're running a mission. Is this correct? You got to,
Correct.
there's an asset somewhere we seized it, or I borrowed it, or we did whatever to get the aircraft with the capacity we needed for this particular operation.
We rented our planes. We could probably we had such good contacts in the private aviation business that we could have rented anything short of the space shuttle, and we did. I mean, we rented Gulfstream G2, Learjets, DC-6, C-47s, different colored aero commanders. So it's the same colored aircraft didn't go in on two missions in a row, for example. We had different seaplane configurations, and we repainted aircraft. In the next mission that we'll talk about real quick, one of our agents goes in Group 7, the Miami Air Smuggling Investigative Group 7, co-located at Homestead Air Force Base with Customs Air Unit. He goes undercover as a Cuban Army general. Guy did a brilliant job. When he spoke, I just wanted to start saluting. He was so good. They built an HF radio station in our like triple wide trailer setup at the base. And he had the introduction. So the bad guys thought they were dealing with a Cuban Army general. And he would close the door to his office in the back, and he would broadcast, and you'd hear a guy who sounded like a general, like issuing orders, and it was great. And the bad guys bought it, hook, line, and sinker. So they came up with some front money. And the deal, my partner and I always had one or two agents in the beginning. And I think we were all eccentrics. Mike R. was a Marine veteran from Vietnam. He was a little old. He was a little older than the rest of us. So I used to tease him like, Mike, it's the second war that you're in. It's not doing too well, the drug war, But anyway, he was a very, very great agent. And Chuck W. was a character. We had a good time together and worked very well together. And he participated in the two of them in future missions that we'll talk about. But we weren't initially invited to participate in this. And this was a case with Customs and the FBI. But eventually the day came when we got approached. So the deal kind of changed. We're going to land in a lake. No, we're not going to land in a lake. We're going to go here. We're going to go there. Then finally it narrows down. We're going to land in a lagoon. I said, look, I don't care where we land if it's in water, but it's got to be 6 feet of water. Everything works out. There was some initial, well, I would call it more than initial frustration. There was a lot of stress involved with this case. There was a lot riding on it. And a customs pilot had been killed in the early stages of this when a Black Hawk ditched in the Florida Keys. And everybody got out except for the pilot in command. Co-pilot only got out because he was a weightlifter, from what I heard. He was a great guy. I used to fly with him. And he managed to get the door open and get out. Everybody else got out through the door gunner windows. But the pilot died. So we had a reason where we wanted to do it for, I don't want to say payback, but we were going to work the case anyway. But when you lose somebody, it just makes it more driven. You're more driven to do it. Understood. So anyway, here we are. We've got our aircraft, and it's another Warbird Vietnam era seaplane. And the compass was off by like 30 degrees, but like, who cares? The plane's not flying itself. The crew is going to fly escorted almost all the way. So I wasn't bent out of shape about this 40-year-old warbird not having a compass that was 100% on the mark, but other people were, and they just kept giving me a hard time about, this particular asset that we had, as if I had an option. Nobody, we're creating this as we're going along. Uncle Sam didn't make this easy for anybody. So they finally get the front money, the plane gets packed up, they go to Gitmo. The Navy was absolutely probably the greatest single helper. They were partners. Using Gitmo back then, before it became a prison camp, it was basically an interdiction base and an undercover base, and also a Navy base. And they did everything under the sun for us. They could not do enough to help us because, like I said, the drug war was the only war we had at the time, and they were looking for missions, and they had the training, they had the people, and why not put it to good use? And
Roger
who
that.
likes drug smugglers? Nobody. So they were more than willing. So we get the plane gets to Gitmo, and the Navy techs had a hard time getting the HF radio in this aircraft to work, and I don't know why. It just didn't work out. So tensions kind of flared up, and the agent who was the acting group supervisor, who brought me to see the SAC to start this off, his name is Pat Roach. He later became my partner. Pat was the acting group soup when this thing was going down, and he kind of kept everybody's party so that things didn't get ugly, because things were getting a little bit stressed out because of this constant problems of trying to launch on time. Well, the best part was, and I guess you can blame me a little bit for this, but when I get the radio message that the Air Force AWAC can't take off, I couldn't resist it. Now I'm having my chops broken because my plane doesn't have a good compass, and the HF radio is not working. Air-to-air radios work fine. And now when I hear the United States Air Force AWAC can't take off, and it's got like $1 billion plane with like a crew of people just standing around, doing their thing, I couldn't help but say, well, my plane can fly. So then things calmed down, and we got back to business. They take off, and there's customs air assets in the air. There's a U.S. Air Force AWAC in the air. They're following the undercover aircraft in. As they get closer and closer to Columbia, they start directing them to go lower and lower in altitude. And by the time they get down to, I think it was about 60 or 70 miles away, they're down to like 200 feet, 100 feet above the water. And they're flying in under Barranquilla radar. And they're going to land in like a lagoon off the coast. It's supposed to be 6 feet of water. It's supposed to be a boat there. No boat. Not in the water anyway. So the crew circles, they see everybody there, they land. And as they land, the plane gets stuck. They hit ground.
Oh, wow.
So the 6 feet of water that they needed turned into 6 feet of mud. Now the plane is stuck. Colombian wades out, bangs on the door. Crew in the back opens the door, and he says he wants to kill the gringo pilot. As if it's our fault that these guys don't know what 6 feet of water is. So thank God the crew that was in the back did a very good job of calming this knucklehead down and said, let's get on with this business, okay? Help us get free of this mud and rock and silt and everything. So the Colombians the people just pile into the area, and they got ropes in a Jeep, and they pull the plane manually, just pull this big Grumman Air seaplane back, and the pilots crank up the engines again, and they go to take off, and they get stuck again. They pull them back again. I think on the third time, they get told, fly inland, go down that dirt road, and you'll see a bunch of guys waving, and that's where your load is. Now, meanwhile, the Colombians are relaying everything to the command post where General Puma, that was the undercover agent's name, is sitting. So there's a little delay in what's going on, because when the Colombian goes out and says he's going to kill the pilot, as they're resolving this, all we hear is they're going to execute the pilot. The other thing that was going on, which was actually kind of humorous at the time, although it kind of pissed me off when it initially happened, was I was supposed to get a co-pilot who spoke German, who could represent an East German, because obviously back in the late 1980s, Cuba was run by the communists.
Exactly. So you could have a, you know,
So to have an East German on board fit perfectly. Captain Video's cover was that he was a smuggler pilot who got forced down over Cuba and had to work 10 loads, had to fly 10 missions for General Puma for his freedom. It was a great cover story because it made perfect sense. At least to us it did. So there's this delay in what's being relayed to us. So I'm sitting in the Group 7 trailer, and we're listening to this message, and all we get is they want to kill the pilot, the gringo pilot. And we think real quick, and we had a good cover story, like as I said, for Captain Video. And General Puma, the agent, Steve, his first name was Steve. He did a job. I wish I would have had an Academy Award handy. I would have opened the drawer and handed it to him. He got on that radio and he started yelling in Spanish. The whole story of this pilot owes me 10 flights. Do not shoot him. I mean, he was very forceful. And they're relaying this to this clown at the beach with the radio. So they back off, and then they start relaying, okay, now they're using ropes, now they're freeing your plane, and then we're getting another call, hey, the plane got stuck again. And then we get another call, the plane got stuck again. And we don't know, but at the time, they said fly inland, go down that dirt road, and you'll pick up a load. So the plane finally takes the water cascading over the cockpit twice. Third time, they finally break free, and they're flying. And instead of making a left to go to Gitmo, they make a right and they fly inland. So I'm at the our little operations center at Homestead Air Force Base, Customs Air Unit, and AWAC reports that the undercover aircraft is now heading inland. And everybody in the room, it was pretty crowded, turned around and looked at me. And the co-case agent said, "Why are they flying inland?" And the only thing I could think of saying at the time was, how the hell do I know? I'm standing here with you. We'll find out soon enough. Let's let this thing play out. You know, there's a read. They didn't change sides in the middle of the battle. They're not working for the bad guys. So, and they're not going to surrender. If they finally took off, it's for a good reason. So they're flying about a few miles inland. They see a guy waving. They drag the dirt road, drag the strip. So instead of coming in like they got stuck on the first Boston mission in the sand, they came in and just touched down and took off, touched down and took off to see what the consistency, how hard packed this dirt road was. And then they turned around, came back and landed. So the Kentucky colonel was the co-pilot, and he could be a pain in my ass, but I really liked him a lot. He had a good sense of humor. And when I asked somebody, does anybody speak German? We need a German co-pilot. He says, I do. So I'll back up. And during the pregame mission, before we took off, we're all in the conference room, and the case agent, I think it was, brought up, and you have your German speaking co-pilot, right? And I turned to the colonel, I call him, and I said, you speak German, right? He goes, sprechen Sie Deutsch? I said, that's it? He goes, yeah, you asked me if I spoke German. That's all I know. And I'm going like, I don't believe this is happening. I got conned by one of my own guys. This is not I'm supposed to be on top of this, you know? So we went anyway with him and just winged it. And I got back at him though. I borrowed his car one night. He had a Mercedes. And I said, hey, can I borrow your car? My undercover car is being fixed. He said, yeah, sure, no problem. Gave me the keys to his car. So I take off. And I go to a mobile gas station. And I call him up and I go, hey, I just filled up your car. You know, I was using it for a few hours. I just filled up your car with gasoline. I mean, it's a diesel. I didn't know that you had a gasoline powered. I thought all Mercedes were diesel. And initially he didn't know what to say. And then I finally said, look, I'm just kidding around. I had to get back at you for like the stunt you pulled. But so we moved on. But they were a colorful crew. So they finally they take off. They land, and they're worried now because their engines are running a little hot. They just had a little bit of a 2.5-hour delay in this lagoon. starting engines, trying to take off, getting pulled back manually, and doing it again and again, and finally taking off. So they shut the engines down, and the colonel there in the co-pilot seat goes, "Gee, I hope it starts." After all this, and Captain Video shaking his head like, "Why did you say that?" And of course, they go to start the engine. Now it doesn't start. Now the Colombians are getting pissed, and they want to load the plane, and they crank it over the second time, and it starts up. They load the plane, they take off, come back. It was a successful initial phase of that controlled delivery. The bad guys ended up airdropping 2,500 more kilos to one of our undercover vessels. U.S. Navy, again, assisted us with hydrofoil gunboats and had them kind of off in the distance and help the crew out if need be. And arrests were made, the case. I think 400,000 in cash was recovered, and a good time was had by all, despite some very stressful moments.
It sounds like as you guys were getting, more missions and more experience, you were a combination of learning what assets were out there. Hey, we can get our hands on this. We can coordinate with these folks. Was your reputation growing within the different agencies that people would want to come to you to offer things and work with you? Or did you always kind of have to go door to door to get this type of support?
No, people came to us in the next, I'd get phone calls at, 10 o'clock at night from an 8. "Nick, I just spoke to, I got a CI, he's meeting with these people, they want to pick up blah, 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 and they want to do this and that." And I would just give them a scenario. And sometimes we would usually work anywhere from 7 to 12 deals at a time. And deal number one that looked like it was going to go, because it was had all the components were lined up the right way, would not go. And deal number 7, which had a lot of weak links in it, all of a sudden became the deal that went, or deal number 12. And that was the good news, bad news, because you had to work every deal as if it was going to go, which is why we spent so much time away from home from 8 in the morning till midnight or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, because you had to work every case as if it was a real deal. You just couldn't sit back going like, "I'm not wasting my time with this," because the one that you thought, experience began to teach us that the one that you thought was going to go didn't go.
So what you guys are out there hustling, talking to CIs, like you said, I'm working 7 to 12 potential deals at once. I gotta, hey, this is suddenly a higher priority because this is hot now. Is this all because there's a sense of that's still that Miami Vice, boat shoe and Hawaiian shirt kind of operation you guys are doing? Is this all in your head in a notebook, or did you guys have an actual, incident room operations cell where you guys track stuff on boards and that kind of like how did you keep track of all this without conflating cases and mixing guys up and that kind of stuff? It just all up in your brain?
We wrote a lot of paper. Everything we did was documented, and every case had a case number. There were reports of investigation written for every contact, all recorded phone call. We had an agent come pick up our tapes once in a case. There was like 60 tapes. He goes, "You have 60 tapes?" I go, "Yeah, what do you think we do here all day?" And we'd be on the phone at 9, 10 o'clock at night, or we'd have an undercover meeting during the day. And then at night, we'd have to call Columbia to see what the results were when the broker called his people down south after meeting us during the day. And then the broker would discuss with his counterparts in Colombia. And then they'd say, "Well, have them call us at night." So they would go out and have dinner at 9, 10 o'clock at night. And then we'd get a phone call from them at the undercover office, or we would call them, or they'd call us and record another conversation. Then we'd sit there for an hour listening to it and strategize over it. So everything was documented, everything was written, nothing was fly by the seat of the pants as it may appear, and everything was approved. We didn't move an inch without approval. But what's interesting was all the approval was verbal. Nobody ever gave us a written order that said, "You can go invade Colombia today and pick up blah, blah, blah."
Understandably so. I kind of get that.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming
So
you would, right? Hey, the sack said go 10:55 today. You probably made it into your notes though.
yes, when we documented everything. In fact, the way we paid our people, our contract people, and our informants and our sources of information further documented everything. So we had what they call payment of information, payment of evidence, POI, POE. So that would enable us to pay somebody, for example, they help us infiltrate a group, and they're going to fly. If you just flew the mission but didn't do anything else as far as meeting bad guys, there was no one ever said to us, by the way, this is what we're paying contract pilots today. We made this stuff up. We sat around one day going like, what do you think it's worth to risk your life to fly into Colombia? I don't know, 40 grand, 80 grand for a pilot and 40 to 60 for a co-pilot. Okay, that's the number. And we talked to the crews and they were willing to, yeah, that's fine. I'll go for that money. And the most we paid, as we'll talk later on down the road, was 100 and a quarter. That was the most it paid.
That's
But
probably
the
real
average,
money back in 1989, right?
oh yeah, yeah. We used to go to the bank when we picked up money, and the other way we paid was according to seizure. So if our sources of information, our assets, helped us seize an asset of value, we could pay up to $250,000 each informant. So we would go to the bank with a duffel bag. Periodically, we'd get notification that the money was transferred from customs headquarters in DC to a bank in Florida. And we would go to the bank, show our credentials to a bank officer, and they'd have the money in cash. And we'd fill a duffel bag and go back to the undercover office. There was no operations room. There was nothing exotic tracking this. This was us every day just going to work and manufacturing this stuff.
Roger.
And then we would sit there and just throw bundles of cash at people, and then they'd have to sign a receipt that they got their 50 grand or 40 grand or 250,000 or whatever it was. It was all cash. Have a nice day.
Did you ever get audited? But by
Yes. Yeah, there were audits conducted. In fact, ironic, down the road, during Hurricane Andrew, my group soup, his house was destroyed, seriously damaged, not totally destroyed, but really damaged. So he wasn't available. So I went down to Homestead Air Force Base during Hurricane Andrew, and the base was shut down. The commanding officer was standing there with the security forces guys. I think they might have still been called air police back then. I'm not sure. Early 1990s. I'm not sure when they made that change. Anyway, he's standing there with like a dozen of them. And the base was destroyed. Looked like it got hit with a nuke.
Roger.
The fuel tanks were overflowing. Jet fuel was leaking, and one of the undercover cars I had was inside a hangar with a Black Hawk. It was an IROC Camaro, and the storm picked the Black Hawk up and smashed it down on top of the Camaro. It was total. So the Black Hawk was damaged too. So the base was wrecked. So I walked up to the base commander and I identified myself, and I looked like a pirate. I had long hair, beard, and whatnot. But I said, look, I guess I'm the acting group supervisor because it's a hurricane. I lived up north. Everybody else lived down south. He said, okay, I'll let one agent on base. One. It's too dangerous to bring people on right now. So I go on base, go into our trailers are destroyed. Vehicles are destroyed. But what do I find? I find the only copy of the books and records for the undercover operation.
Oh, wow.
This proved where every penny was spent. Now, if you were a crook, if you were a dirty agent, and you were the guy that found those records, and you deep sixed them or put them in a burn barrel, there'd be no way anybody could. So we turned them in. We had nothing to hide. Here you go. So yes, there were audits, and everything worked out fine.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. So that just again the ad hoc nature of it, and it just sounds like you had the right guys doing the right things, because there's so many ways this could have gone south if you recruited pilots who weren't as good as they said they were. Like you said, if you had somebody who had a little too much moral flexibility on the team, if that Colombian who wanted to shoot the pilot was a little too quick on the trigger and didn't care what anyone was saying. There's a lot of places y'all could have got off the narrow path on this one. That's just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. At the time, I just had to believe it was divine intervention. I mean, I used to stand on the runway on the tarmac when they took off every time, and I'd pray for these guys. I'd say, God, these guys are angels with dirty faces. What could I tell you? But they're doing good things right now.
There you go,
So
out there doing the Lord's work, right?
they're right. They're doing your work now, going after some bad guys. So use them as your instrument. Please bring that plane back that should be hanging in the Smithsonian Institution. But and like I said, as we progressed, the aircraft that we started to use as often as possible became more sophisticated and a little bit newer.
Roger that. And you also, and we're about out of time, but that's a great place to leave it, because not only are the aircraft getting more sophisticated, but it sounds like the missions are getting more sophisticated and your ingress and egress methods are getting more sophisticated. So the next time we get together, we're going to talk about an adventure that, even though you guys worked with air ops, it didn't even take place in the air, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. It was a combination air and undercover vessel operation where we had to circumvent the rules of engagement, and the only way to do it was go by boat.
Oh, fantastic, guys. So tune in next time when Nick Jacobellis comes back and we talk about how the customs guys get their own Navy for the next operation. So everybody, this has been Ben Powers with the Commander's Voice. Again, my guest has been friend of show Nick Jacobellis. We're still talking about the height of the drug wars down in Florida in the late 80s, early 90s. Nick, thank you for coming out and sharing your stories.
Thank you, Ben. Looking forward to next time.
Roger that. You have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.